Colette, I think you can start.
Okay, next slide, please. Well, good morning and welcome to the Roadmap to Mill Redevelopment, a four-part webinar series. I'm Colette Santasiri, Executive Director of the New Jersey Institute of Technology's Technical Assistance to Brownfields Communities program, otherwise known as NJIT TAB. Today, NJIT and EPA Region 1 are presenting the final webinar in the series, Adapting to Change. Next slide. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. All participants will be muted during the webinar. At any time during this webinar, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box and make sure that the setting is to all. If you have a question for a specific speaker, please indicate that. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the NJIT website, www.njit.edu/tab. Look under the Resources tab. Next slide. Today's program features four speakers: Dennis Diesel, Lee Pouliot, Patrick McKenna, and Ben Carlson. More about our speakers in a few minutes. Next slide. As mentioned, this webinar is being brought to you by the NJIT TAB program and EPA Region 1. The New Jersey Institute of Technology's Technical Assistance to Brownfields Communities program, with funding from EPA, provides free technical assistance to state, regional, county, tribal, and local government entities and nonprofits who want to transform brownfield sites into community assets. For more information, please contact NJIT TAB via email at tab@njit.edu or call us at 973-642-4165, and please visit our website. Next slide. The Roadmap to Mill Redevelopment, as I mentioned, is a four-part webinar series. All of the webinar speakers work in New England, and all of the examples of redeveloped mills in this series are from the New England states. We have already held 3 webinars. The recordings of those webinars can be found on the NJIT TAB website, and the recording of this webinar will be posted on the NJIT website within a few days. Next slide. Now, here to talk about the great work EPA is doing, it is my honor to introduce Dennis Diesel, Administrator at EPA Region 1. Dennis is a New Hampshire native who has spent much of his life working in public service in the nation's capital and joined EPA having worked for over 20 years on energy, environment, and homeland security matters in the federal government. He most recently worked at Dow as the Director of Federal Government Affairs, where he focused on environment, energy, and regulatory affairs. Dennis, welcome.
Thanks, Colette, for the introduction. I hope this is working. On behalf of EPA Region 1, welcome to today's fourth and final webinar on historic mill revitalization. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. As I noted during the kickoff webinar for this series, mill revitalization is personally and professionally important to me. My great-grandparents came to New England to work in the mills of Manchester, New Hampshire, and New Bedford, Mass, and Manville, Rhode Island, where they were able to build the bedrock of my family's connections to the region. A story that I'm sure resonates with many of you. I'm not entirely sure how big the attendance overlap has been across these 4 programs, but for those who have been with us for all 4 events, I'm sure you will agree that we've had many great conversations. We launched this effort with a discussion of vision. What purposes can the old mills, tanneries, warehouses, industrial sites serve? How can they help drive community revitalization? How can they create new jobs? What new opportunities can these sites generate? We then turned to a discussion of revitalization challenges, COVID not the least among them. Then importantly, we covered a host of pathways for community and site financing. And one last time, I'll take this opportunity to plug our competitive Brownfield grant program. Applications are actually due tomorrow, October 28th. Good luck to any potential applicants. And then finally today, we'll hear about some of these successful strategies for building a vision, tackling challenges, and securing financing. We've seen successes at historic mill sites across New England, including in Chicopee, Massachusetts, where just before the pandemic hit, I had the pleasure of touring the River Mills redevelopment area. Portions of this site have already led to a new senior center and housing facility, and the city has great plans for continued neighborhood revitalization. We'll be hearing today from Lee from the city of Chicopee, who's on today's panel. During his time as the director of planning, the director of the planning department for Chicopee, I know that they've received over $3 million in direct brownfields funding from EPA. And at the request of EPA headquarters, due in no small part to his commitment and expertise, Lee presented Chicopee's recent area-wide final plan at the National Brownfields Conference. In closing, know that your work remediating just one mill, one building, or one historic property can have a resounding community-wide impact. We've learned even from the brownfield process that communities leverage more than $17 in private funding for every dollar invested in brownfields grants. Communities that have previously received brownfields grants have leveraged 9 jobs per $100,000 of brownfield grant funding spent. And so the program is truly impactful. This work can drive green infrastructure, spark new local food hubs, provide space for technical education facilities, and trigger manufacturing sector investments, all leading to healthier communities and more resilient local economies. So on behalf of everyone at Region 1, I hope you and your families continue to be safe and healthy, and thank you again for taking the time today to join these workshops. I know how challenging it has been balancing life, work, all the challenges we're facing during these trying times. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you again to NGIT for this great webinar series. Stay safe and be well. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Colette.
Well, thank you, Dennis. And we so appreciate that you've joined us for every one of the webinars. So next slide, please. During this webinar series, we have heard about the history of New England's iconic mills in general, and then the history of the specific mills we've featured. We've learned that these mills were extremely important to the industrialization of the U.S. and the settlement of many New England towns. In many cases, these mills were the center of community life. When the mills closed, a void was felt in many of these company towns. With the repurposing of mills, new life has been breathed into these structures, but they function very differently than originally planned. We will get a glimpse of those new functions from our speakers. Next slide. Our first presenter is Lee Pouliot, Director of the Planning Department for the City of Chicopee, Massachusetts. He is a member of the American Planning Association and the American Society of Landscape Architects. Lee and his department oversee a variety of projects and planning initiatives, including comprehensive and site-specific planning, zoning, subdivision and development regulations, urban design, and brownfields assessment and cleanup. Prior to his current role, Lee served as a planner and administrator with the city's Office of Community Development. Lee holds a Master of Landscape Architecture from Cornell University and a Bachelor of Science in Ornamental Horticulture, specializing in environmental design from Delaware Valley University. Lee, welcome. Next slide.
Good morning, everybody. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you both to EPA Region 1 and NJIT for inviting me to present during this particular webinar. I will be speaking about River Mills at Chicopee Falls, which is really a combination of 2 former mill properties in the Chicopee Falls neighborhood of the city of Chicopee. And really our focus today will be on an effort towards developing a new urban vision for these properties and how that's been realized in redevelopment to date, and where the city hopes to take redevelopment in the next phase of work we have planned. Next slide. So just in brief, for those who may not be familiar with the city of Chicopee, we are a small Western Massachusetts gateway city. We are, however, the second largest city in Western Massachusetts. We have a population of just under 56,000 people, and we have deep, deep industrial roots here. Chicopee really, as a city, it's formed today as the result of three mill villages that really exploded in growth and grew into one another. And they're reflected in the yellow stars that you see on the map on this slide. From north, we have Willimantic, and then just south of that, beyond the Chicopee River, is Chicopee Center, or what was historically known as Cabottville. And then the star to the east of Chicopee Center is Chicopee Falls, which is the neighborhood that we'll be speaking about today. And really, these mill villages were sort of little communities unto themselves. The mills, housing, businesses, basics of daily life were all provided within these neighborhoods. And as these facilities grew, they kind of melded and formed the town and future city of Chicopee. A lot of the growth in the city following all of this industrial work was really mid 1900s suburban infill that really filled in the voids to kind of build out the city with the structure you see today. Not unlike any other American industrial town, we experienced deindustrialization, particularly after the World Wars, and Chicopee Falls was very hard hit. One of the leading manufacturers in this neighborhood was a tire company, Fisk Tire, which then was known as US Rubber, and eventually was owned by Michelin. And over time, we saw sort of the emptying of these large industrial areas. And that really left us today in a contemporary setting with this legacy of large industrial brownfield tracts in the hearts of our most densest neighborhoods, significant job losses, population decline, and a need to kind of rethink what these properties could do and how they could serve the community in a contemporary context. As you can tell from this map of the city, we are a highly built out community. There are no large undeveloped tracts across the city that can really have a large impact on our economy or meeting any needs from that perspective. We're pretty built out. However, these brownfields tracts, particularly in Chicopee Falls, are rather large, and they're in the heart of our most dense urban neighborhoods, which makes this a prime opportunity for rethinking them and reconnecting them to the rest of their neighborhoods. Next slide, please. And so it's interesting for us to look at sort of the contemporary context of the city. This map, again, just layers on some additional data from the previous slide and looking at where our neighborhood environmental justice populations are. And you can see, for the most part, our densest concentrations of environmental justice populations line up with the three historic industrial mill villages: Willimantic, Chicopee Center, and Chicopee Falls. And again, for Chicopee Falls, you can see that yellow star. Chicopee within Massachusetts received the Gateway City designation, and gateway cities through Mass Inc. are defined as mid-sized urban centers that anchored regional economies and had industrial developments that offered good jobs and a gateway into the American dream. And that is very true here. These neighborhoods were responsible for a number of people coming to Chicopee and making a life here for them and their families. And today we now layer on the reality that the brownfields left behind by those industries are brownfields, and they are where we have the largest opportunity to start thinking about the contemporary needs of the city. Next slide, please. So the legacy of our brownfields is reflected in a number of ways. And in this slide, I just wanted to show both the town and city seals for Chicopee. The town seal looks like any New England mill town. It was the dense mill concept and showing what that looked like. And then in our city seal, the phrase Industriae Variae, which translates to varied industries, which still holds true today with the number of manufacturing and industrial-based entities we have in the city. But there was this recognition how, you know, industry can kind of vary even through time. Next slide, please. There's great pride here in a number of the entities that call Chicopee home. And if you have the opportunity to talk to some of Chicopee's older generations, many of them will be able to tell you of the time they spent working at some of these companies, or a parent or a grandparent who worked at some of these companies. Fisk Tire was a very large manufacturing facility in Chicopee Falls. They had the capacity of manufacturing up to 7,000 tires a day at their facility. There were 3 shifts of workers at that facility, and they were located in Chicopee Falls. Stevens Duryea, an American car manufacturer, manufactured in Chicopee Falls. J. Stevens Arms and Tool was another well-known entity. Victor Bicycles, the FaceMate Corporation, which was a contemporary textile mill, and even Johnson & Johnson manufactured in the city for a period of time. And there are these great stories that come out of how these companies supported the communities and offered an opportunity for residents that otherwise would not have existed in the city. These were economic engines, and their purpose was manufacturing, and you know, people came here for those opportunities. But today, all of these entities are gone. Every mill that was operated by one of these entities is vacant or demolished at this point. And so the question becomes, what are the contemporary needs, and how do we start addressing that? Next slide, please. So the former Uniroyal and FaceMate properties are shown on this slide, and they are the 2 major brownfields properties in Chicopee Falls. Uniroyal is the name that we call the former Fisk plant. Uniroyal, again, was one of the tire manufacturers that operated that facility. FaceMate to the north was a textile mill. Between these 2 properties, we have about 49 acres in a very dense urban neighborhood along the Chicopee River that is prime for redevelopment. And that was recognized early on by the city when this project became a reality for city leaders. And I've laid out a timeline here of what that looked like for us. We had a tax title process that began in 2009. We spent 2 years going through redevelopment planning. Phase 1 efforts focused on the FaceMate property between assessment and cleanup, and 2 developments, our senior center and assisted living. And we're getting ready to announce a developer for lot number 1, which is to the south of our senior center. And then Uniroyal really is our phase 2 work that's ongoing. We've been working on that for close to 10 years now, and are looking forward to getting a developer on site there. Next slide. So here we had both some academic work and some professional planning work to come up with a redevelopment plan for these properties. And that plan is known as the River Mills at Chicopee Falls Vision Plan. And we were very careful to call it a vision plan versus a master plan because we wanted the flexibility to let these redevelopments be what they needed to be as projects came online. They were both informed by significant community process and highlighted the need for a mixed-use program for redevelopment that allowed this neighborhood to reconnect to the Chicopee River. Next slide. And this is what that process looks like, particularly for FaceMate. We spent over $10 million on assessment and cleanup work. Every square inch of this property was stripped, dug through to address environmental contamination. And we ran into many, many surprises, from underground storage tanks that we didn't know about, brick culverts, which you can see in this slide, and, you know, and an honest reflection that we weren't going to be able to save every single building between these two complexes. Next. However, at the end of the day, we ended up with our first redevelopment project, which is the city's senior center, a 12,000 square foot facility, about a $9 million construction project that replaced a less than 5,000 square foot facility that the seniors were using in another area of the city. And this project was critical as it really set the tone for redevelopment across this project. This facility opened in 2014. Next slide. That was followed along with the opening in 2019 of the River Mills Assisted Living Facility, and this was a private development of approximately $24 million adjacent to the senior center that's offering 110 units of assisted living housing, and more critically, an Alzheimer's and dementia care facility, which was identified not only in Chicopee, but our region as a significant need. Next slide. And so Uniroyal is where we really talk about the city having to be honest with how much it can tackle in one fell swoop. This was a very large complex of over 24 buildings. We identified it as phase 2 for redevelopment. And through the next series of slides, you'll see our progression towards cleanup and eventual redevelopment. So this is what the facility looked like in 2010 when the city had ownership. Slide. This is where we were circa 2014 with the removal of our lower tier buildings. Next slide. And this is where we are. This is where we were in the summer of 2019 during our most recent abatement and demolition project for the middle tier structures. Next slide. Overall, this is the progression of work on this GIS map. We had a number of buildings here that were just in such poor quality that they were not viable for redevelopment. The 4 buildings that you see in green and blue, 25, 26, 27, and 42, are all being slated for redevelopment. We've done abatement in 26, and our next project with EPA support through the Brownfields program will do abatement in 27 and 42. And following the finishing of that phase of work, the city will finally be prepared to offer this property to the private development community for redevelopment. Next slide. Just go through these quickly. So this is what assessment and cleanup looks like at Uniroyal. These are large scale buildings that totaled some 3 million square feet of industrial manufacturing space. And so they're large and complex, require longer timelines, and the same surprises we saw during phase 2 of our work. Next slide. And similar to FaceMate, we've taken unique approaches to things here. A lot of our asphalt, brick, and concrete is being recycled on site and used as backfill for these extremely large foundations that we have to fill in to allow for future redevelopment. And that has really been one of the efforts that we focused on to keep our costs low while preparing for these properties' futures. But you can imagine some of these buildings just had incredibly large foundations. Next slide. And with that, I'll leave you with some very simple lessons that I've learned over the past 10 years working on these projects. Partnerships are key. For a city our scale, without the EPA, resources from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts through Mass DEP and Mass Development and other members of our support team, Chicopee would not have been able to get to where we are today. We've had to be very aggressive in identifying funding sources beyond just the city's budget to make this work possible. And that's really how we've phased in our work over time to get to the endpoints that we're seeing. We had to be really honest with, from an economic perspective, what's possible. And we've been very focused on that and making sure that we deal with as much environmental work as we can to allow developers to move a project forward. And of course, none of what I'm talking about here would be possible if we didn't have community buy-in, which is why planning efforts that supported community ideas for these properties was so critical. Next slide. And that's it, that's me. And with that, I will say thank you, and we can move forward.
Well, thank you so much, Lee. Next slide. Our next presenter, excuse me, is Patrick McKenna. As a senior project manager at Community Solutions, Patrick is responsible for the day-to-day management of the real estate development activities from concept to construction completion for the Hartford, Connecticut projects as part of the Inspiring Places team. Prior to Community Solutions, Patrick worked as an architect for more than 10 years in his native Ireland and the US on a wide range of projects, including residential, commercial, mixed use, cultural, and education. Patrick is passionate about sustainable design, urban farming, and the role that good design and building rehabilitation can have on the social, environmental, and economic issues facing our most vulnerable communities. He's the co-founder of Architecture for Humanity in New Haven, Connecticut, and the chair of the building committee of the local Habitat for Humanity. Patrick received a BS in architecture from Queen's University in Ireland and a diploma in architecture from Mackintosh School of Architecture in Glasgow, Scotland. Patrick is going to speak about the transformation of the Swift factory. So full disclosure here, Swift factory was not a mill, but I specifically added Swift factory to this webinar on mills redevelopment to demonstrate that factories like mills were important to New England's settlement and prosperity. All of the topics we covered in this webinar series, contamination, historic preservation, structural issues, funding and financing, all apply to the redevelopment of former factory buildings as well. And just like mills, these factories can be brought back to life. So welcome, Patrick, and please proceed.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. So thanks for in the conversation today. Thanks to EPA for its continued support on the project. I see we have some friends from DCD in Connecticut as well, so I'm just want to shout them out as well and thank them for their support on the project. So Swift Factory is a former gold leaf manufacturing facility. It's in the north end of Hartford, which is the capital of Connecticut. If you go to the next slide, please. I'll tell you a little bit about our organization first before I start talking about the neighborhood and then the factory itself and on what we've done to refurbish the building. I work for Community Solutions. We're a national nonprofit organization. Our goal is around finding a sustainable end to homelessness that leaves no one behind. We do this by helping communities build cheaper, more user-friendly health and social welfare systems. We're kind of best known nationally for our Built for Zero campaign, which works with 85 communities, and 11 of which have ended either chronic or veterans homelessness in their communities. Another 42 are achieving kind of measurable reductions, and that's achieved over 113,000 housed over 113,000 formerly homeless people in the country. We also have a real estate development wing that gets involved with projects if that's required. We've rehab projects in Brooklyn, New York, in DC, and just outside Denver, Colorado. So next slide, please. I'm here to talk about a project in the north end of Hartford. Hartford is a city of about just under 125,000 people. The neighborhood where the factory is about 11,000 people. It's predominantly African American community with high rates of poverty and unemployment, low rates of educational achievement, and home ownership. You know, typical to many kind of urban cores in New England. Next slide, please. This neighborhood has suffered greatly over the decades, starting in the 1930s with FHA and redlining. You know, the neighborhood was cut off from the city center by the construction of I-84. And suffered greatly under with the riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King in Many of the vacant lots in the neighborhood have been vacant, you know, from that time. Next slide, please. The neighborhood was designated as a federal promise zone in 2015. The promise zone includes the northeast neighborhood where the Swift factory is, as well as two neighboring neighborhoods, Clay Arsenal and Upper Albany. The Swift factory here is highlighted in the middle. The promise zone, the North Hartford promise zone, is the only promise zone in New England. It was an Obama era initiative that designates communities of high poverty but with high capacity for change, and allows those communities to get priority points when applying for federal grants. And we've been able to take advantage of that in a number of the federal grants that we've received. The neighborhood is within walking distance of downtown Hartford, and also boasts Keeney Park, one of the largest urban park in New England. Next slide, please. As well as the Keeney Park, you know, there are a number of other assets in the neighborhood. You know, cultural centers, art centers, community centers, but more importantly, a kind of a vibrant community. Next slide, please. The Swift factory itself, as I mentioned, is a former gold leaf manufacturing facility. It started in 1887 by Matthew Swift. It was in the Swift family for 5 generations. Was one of the largest gold leaf manufacturers in its time, employing over 300 people. And like many 19th century mill and factory buildings, it was in a residential neighborhood. It actually predated the neighborhood. The neighborhood built up around it, and like many of these buildings are in, you know, great places where people can walk to work, and they are perfect for transit-oriented development. The building, the factory closed in 2005, lay vacant for a number of years, was threatened with demolition. A local community organization and preservation group, the Hartford Preservation Alliance, were concerned about losing the building and wanted to bring some economic development to the neighborhood, and reached out to our organization to see if we'd be interested in taking on the project. And we had just finished rehabbing a historic building in downtown Hartford. So in 2010, the building was donated to Community Solutions. Next slide, please. The site is about 2.5 acres, much smaller than the Chickpea site we just saw. It's a collection of 5 interconnected buildings, dating from 1887 till 1948. It also has 2 historic homes on the property, and all buildings are on the state and federal historic register. This aerial view gives you a sense of the context of the site. Lots of triple-decker apartment buildings abutting the property. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there are 2 homes on the property. We imaginatively call them the Grey House and the White House. The White House was where the factory started in 1887. It's an old farmhouse, literally in farmland when Matthew Swift purchased it, and the neighborhood built up around it. The Grey House was built a few years later in 1914 and was the home for the Swift family for a number of years. Next slide, please. The factory buildings themselves are a variety of kind of styles and constructions. They are pitched roof and double hung windows, wood siding, also kind of flat roof and large steel windows, as I say, ranging from 1895 till 1948. Next slide, please. When the building was donated to Community Solutions, our first task was to reach out to the neighborhood to see what they needed and how the Swift factory could help. With my colleague John Thomas, who's a neighborhood resident, spoke to about 270 people in the neighborhood, and we heard from them, like many people, they were concerned about youth engagement, public safety, and jobs. So new housing was not a high priority on their list. You know, as we tried to develop our ideas for what to do with the building, next slide, please, We also started a community engagement process to try and understand the neighbourhood. We worked on a neighbourhood sustainability plan that identified 4 physical interventions that could be made in the neighbourhood and the positive health impacts that they might have around pedestrian and bike safety, reactivating vacant lots, making Keeney Park more productive, and improving the urban tree canopy. Next slide, please. With this in hand, we try to implement some of those measures in a kind of a placemaking effort. We hosted bike repair on our site. We hosted public art events. We had healthy food events as well. We put up a little free library. All of these ways to try and get to know the community and have the community kind of get to know us a little bit more and feel a little bit more comfortable with this organization coming into the neighborhood and starting to kind of work on a building. Next slide, please. One of the kind of most well-known interventions that we did was to run a competition to design an installation. This was the kind of Live Love banner. Our building address is on Love Lane, and words live and love intertwined together that say live together and love each other. Next slide, please. Along with this, we also hosted an urban farm on the property run by a local nonprofit, Hartford Food System. You know, and during that process, we learned, you know, how jobs in the food sector are accessible to people who are from the neighborhood who may not have finished high school or have other barriers to employment. And you know, food is a growing sector of the economy. And so one of the ideas that we had for the factory was to try and entice kind of food businesses to come to the factory. And when we spent many years kind of working with tenants to try and identify those who'd be willing to take space and rent parts of the building. Next slide, please. And so what we've kind of ended up with is a building that has no residential in it. You know, we again tried to listen to the community. They were concerned about jobs and employment and education and safety. And so even though our mission as an organization is to end homelessness, there's no housing on the site. We have a series of food kitchens, small incubator kitchens for caterers and food trucks. We have a shared office for small businesses who want to grow. We also have some open loft space that's available for larger commercial tenants. And then on the 2 houses on the property, we have an organization that does behavioral health as well as martial arts training. And in the White House, we have a small Montessori style school who's trying to improve educational achievement in the neighborhood. Next slide, please. So the building was given to us, and it took us until 2018 before we could start construction. During that time, as I mentioned, we were working on community engagement, but also we were trying to find tenants and raise the funds. And in order to do a project like this, it requires a broad mix of capital. You know, by 50% of the project is funded by historic or by tax credits, federal and state historic tax credits by 25%, and new markets tax credits about another 25%. We have some grants from the federal government, including EPA, to do kind of the site remediation on the project. We also had grants and loans from the state of Connecticut, particularly the DCD Brownfields division, to do building abatement and demolition in the building itself. We also have some private philanthropy and some mortgage as well. Next slide, please. With all of these different funding sources come different bidding, hiring, and wage requirements, and so it was kind of a complicated matrix of public competitive bidding, living wage, prevailing wage, and so across the board we adopted the city's living wage requirements for anyone working on the site, and we also adopted the city's hiring goals of having at least 30% of the construction hours done by Hartford residents and about 20% done by female and minority workers. We felt that jobs being important, something that we heard from the community was that the community had an opportunity to work on the project during construction and not just when the project was finished. Next slide, please. So I'm happy to say that we finished the first phase of construction in November 2019. The first phase was the core and shell work. Replaced all the windows, did masonry restoration, complete sill replacement, all the site work, drainage, landscaping, parking, and then core kind of MEP infrastructure. As you can see from the groundbreaking, there were a lot of funders and groups that were participated in the project to make it happen. Next slide, please. And we have just finished the interior phase of construction on 2 parts of the building. Those are 2 parts of the building that we ourselves are going to operate. That's about a 10,000 square foot shared office space for small businesses, and about a 4,500 square foot a kitchen space, series of 10 commercial kitchens for caterers and food trucks. We have tenants who have moved in there already. This part of the project was funded by the federal government through the EDA, and so had to be bid separately, which is why it was a separate contract. And through this, we've next slide, please. We've been tracking our construction numbers. I'm happy to say that our goal was 30% of the construction hours done by Hartford residents. As of September, we are 35% of the construction hours were done by Hartford residents. About 11% total are from the actual neighbourhood itself, and 65% of the construction hours have been done by minority and female workers. And as I mentioned, it was important to us to have people who look like the neighbourhood working on the project, and to have the tenants who move into the building kind of look like the neighbourhood. And I'm also happy to report that of the offices that we have 11 offices leased, small offices, and all 11 are Black-owned businesses, many female-owned businesses. And we wanted to provide. It's important not just to provide jobs, but to provide positive examples of success in the community that has seen its share of violence and kind of negative examples of success. With that, it's just thanks again for next slide, please, for allowing me to be part of the conversation, and look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you, Patrick. We appreciate that you joined us today. So our last presenter is Ben Carlson, Director of Urban Design at Goody Clancy. He has served as project manager and lead urban designer on diverse master planning architecture projects, with emphasis on revitalizing downtowns, transitioning industrial areas, neighborhoods, and university innovation districts. Ben has managed much of Goody Clancy's award-winning work for cities, developing urban design strategy, directly engaging community members, and integrating diverse technical and stakeholder input into achievable applied visions. Ben brings case study experience from several New England towns leveraging their industrial legacy for contemporary economic and community development. He's active in the Boston Society of Architecture and holds architecture degrees from Yale and the University of California, Berkeley. This last presentation of the series takes us full circle. Ben is going to tell us about how the repurposing of mills is serving as a catalyst for community revitalization. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Colette, and it's great to be with everybody this morning. As Colette mentioned, I'll be talking about 2 communities that already have seen a great deal of success revitalizing and reoccupying their mills, and now they're looking toward the next chapter in new construction, new development, economic development, and the infrastructure needed to make that happen. Moving to the next slide, some questions we'll look at are access. How do you get to a site? How do you create or deepen a sense of place? And how does the architecture of that new development fit in with the old? Next slide. starting with a little bit of background, and then we'll look at the case studies. This is just a little bit of Site Access 101. The two images on the far left are a demonstration of what you need in terms of parking if you are really dependent on surface parking lot, and many sites are. If you move to the middle example, if you're able to invest in some structured parking, that gives you more capacity for development, more flexibility for open space. And the two images on the right demonstrate what happens when you've got good transit, walkability, maybe the opportunity to share some parking spaces between residents and workers, starts to enable more investment, more open space, and more options. And so we'll see a few examples that demonstrate how we think about access infrastructure. Next slide. This is Manchester, New Hampshire. We'll go deeper into this later, but the image above shows part of the Amoskeag Mill Complex along the Merrimack River, a massive mill complex built in the 19th century. In the 1960s, as part of urban renewal, about 15 of 75 mills were torn down to create parking. And in this case, I think Manchester senses that was the right decision to make, because that's enabled these mills to be reoccupied with a whole series of businesses and universities. But now they're starting to feel the limitation. They need more access. They could put more workers and residents in, but they just can't get there. Next slide. This example is from New Haven, Connecticut, the former Winchester Arms plant. It's now a science and research destination. And on the left, you see the giant parking garage that was built there to enable this to be an intensive workplace. It's also an example of reusing old rail infrastructure. In the foreground is a corridor that used to be a railroad track. It's been revived as a trail, recreational trail. So people can actually bike to work here from other neighborhoods in New Haven, and it's a nice amenity. Next. The next example is in Stamford, Connecticut, and it shows what you can do when you have really good transit nearby. In the foreground is mill buildings that have been renovated as housing, and there's a lot of new housing next to it, and there's relatively less need for parking here because there's a very busy Metro North and Amtrak station a couple blocks away, as well as lots of jobs in downtown Stamford. So depending on your location and the range of ways you can get to a site, that shapes your opportunity. Next. In terms of placemaking, so many of our mills are on rivers, and in many cases there's already park space or other elements that leverage that, but many times there's opportunities to do more, extend those trails, or get people out of the water to even further celebrate the place that the water creates. Next. Part of it is looking towards outdoor programming, not just inside the buildings. Even if you just have a humble parking lot, if that's shaped by some buildings, whether it's your existing ones or some new ones, that can create a great destination. Next image. It's a typo in this slide. It's actually Bakery Square in Pittsburgh, but this is where Google has opened offices in Pittsburgh. And again, there's been a lot of attention to creating active outdoor places and nice landscape in a mix of historic and new development. Next. Finally, there's the question of the architecture, and in many cases, there's a strong case for the new development to look different in terms of its design and character from the historic fabric, and yet it needs to fit in terms of urban form. We'll see some examples of this later. So slide, we'll move into Manchester and move image. The mill yard successfully reoccupied with private sector research as well as university occupancy. And there's an interest by the mill owners and businesses to have better access. That they could make more intensive use of these buildings if it were easier to get there. So the image at top right is from a planning meeting I was involved in earlier this year, when we could still meet like that, to look at further opportunities. And so moving to the next slide, what we were looking at was opportunity to really expand this district. So the mill yard, the historic mill buildings are up near the mill yard label. And next to that is downtown, which has been successfully revived in Manchester with housing and some retail. And we were looking at the whole area in the middle of this image, which used to be the railroad yards that really served the old mill economy. There's some light industrial uses there. There's a baseball stadium, but it's still a pretty unleveraged, underutilized area. And Manchester really wanted to see what it could do to get more value out of this place. So moving to the next image, this is of our study that looked at how could we introduce new development here. And there's the photo on the bottom shows some mill restoration that's actually happening elsewhere in this area today. But the key here was adding new infrastructure. It's adding a few new streets, crossing an existing track, a new street network, and connect this underutilized area to the mill yard, to downtown, to the neighborhoods around it. It's about adding a trail network because there are some nice riverfront trails and a nice trail that crosses the river, but they're a bit fragmented. So it's using this area to link to other trails and make it a great whole network of trails, which are both practical for biking or walking to work, but also recreational amenity. And it's about transit. There's a long-term goal of establishing commuter rail service from here to Lowell and Boston. That may take 10 years, but there's also a near-term opportunity for an improved bus shuttle service that could really open up options. So moving to the next slide, this illustrates the idea from that shuttle. This will be a frequent shuttle running along that yellow line in the diagram on the right that might be like the examples on the left. The one on top is in Providence. It's an autonomous vehicle shuttle. The one on the left is one in the Hartford region that has very nice stops, real-time information on service. If you can provide this level of amenity and ease of use, that can be quite attractive. And business and mill owners are actually interested in helping fund and help operate a service like this because they're already having to shuttle people in from remote parking. So that's a benefit to them. Next slide. Part of the challenge is placemaking and making this a real destination. This is an example of an existing place designated as the Gaslight District that hasn't really come alive yet. So moving to the next image, we see a way here for partnership between the city, making a fairly modest investment in turning this lightly used alley into a place for people, and the property owners around it who are interested in bringing in businesses that could enliven this place, make it a place for food to support other uses around it. And then next slide, a longer term opportunity for placemaking. The adjacent buildings are former mill buildings that are being used. But if you move to the next slide, this shows what can happen when we have transit, we have walkability, we don't depend so much on cars and parking lots. We're able to devote more of that street space to people and to new investment that actually brings back the intensity that the mills used to have in this area. Next. So to summarize for Manchester, it's about near-term trail network, a frequent shuttle service within 3 years, longer-term rail service that make this a much easier place to get to, reduce our need to devote a lot of room and cost toward parking. It's about leveraging the riverfront, trails, turning streets into places for people, using buildings to shape streets and public space. And we'll move on now to Biddeford, quickly run through that example. Next slide. Biddeford is paired with Saco, Maine. They flank the Saco River in this photo here. And they've been quite successful. Just about all of the mill buildings you see in this image either are already occupied or they're in the process of being revitalized. On the left is the Pepperell Mill campus, mostly employment in there, and some other spaces are being turned into housing. The site we're focused on in this project is that vacant one in the middle, just beyond the smokestack. It used to be a trash to energy plant, and the city of Biddeford bought that plant, tore it down, and wanted to create economic development here and connect people to the river, because ironically, the mills have actually obstructed public access to the river for a long time. So in the next slide, we'll see a vision, and I've been doing some work with a developer who is purchasing some parts of that site and working with the city to help create the infrastructure needed for that development. Next image. A key idea, again, is leveraging all the different ways we can access the site. The letter P is the parking structure. The city is building a parking structure here that will be shared among many uses. But a big part of this is also leveraging walking connections, all those red lines, to the downtown, to housing in the neighborhoods around, so that you don't need to drive so much. And then the purple dot on the right is an Amtrak station with Downeaster rail service to Portland and Boston, which is an important amenity that's a little hard to get to. So part of the thinking is, can we create a pedestrian bridge across the river to make it easier to get to that? And so in the next slide, this represents the beginning of a process where the cities of Saco and Biddeford are now working. They've just hired a team to explore designing a bridge that's not just a practical connection to transit, but it could also be a real iconic signature of this place and a great way to experience the river and the heritage around it. Next. Then this is Pearl Street. Today it's just an industrial driveway, but moving to the next slide, this is a concept of the transportation hub. So sketched on the left is the parking structure that the city is now building. This would also have local transit rerouted to stop here and active uses along that parking garage. So it's actually an active building activating the street. Next. Moving further toward the river, we want to, again, take this alley and make it a great public place. And so in the next slide, this shows how we can think about a street not just as vehicular access. We need a little bit of vehicular access, but it can actually be a public space with slow-moving vehicles and space for people to actually walk right through the middle of the street and make the riverfront park in the distance actually feel like it's beginning a block or two into the city. Next slide. This is looking the other way from the riverfront, and going to the next slide is a concept of how the riverfront can be transformed. The City of Biddeford is starting a public planning process for park space and a river walk along that river. And then the new development on the right would really try to connect with that in a very strong way by having restaurant, dining space spilling out next to it, and then a mix of housing and office space beyond that in the distance, so that the public space and the private development really have a strong relationship. Next. The final point is thinking about the architecture. And so as the developer thinks about this new development and how it fits into a mill district, they're thinking about how can we be just a little bit different. The idea is to build at a scale that's similar to what the mills are like, but to offer some amenities that the mill don't. Be renewable significant views, or it might be mixed use, like the building at top left that mixes grocery store and housing and office space. Not to sort of diminish the value that the mills have, but to put out a product that's not actually replicating them, but it's providing something different in the marketplace. Next slide. And to sum up, again, it's about creating a variety of different access opportunities so that we can leave more space for people and not cars. It's about really leveraging place, connecting to rivers that may not be accessible enough. And it's about thinking of how new development can fit in, but offer something that's a little bit different from those already do. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Ben. For those of you who have been with us over multiple webinars, you'll recognize that Ben was one of our presenters in our second webinar, so we appreciate your participation. So we have a few minutes for questions. Sean Vroom, the director of the NJIT TARE program, will facilitate the Q&A portion of this webinar. Sean?
Thank you, Colette. We do have one question. It's for Lee. And the question is the city managing the environmental cleanup directly, or have you contracted with cleanup contractors? And then it has two more parts to the question: is how many individuals are involved with the abatement and demolition, and what is the budget for the Uniroyal demo?
Sure. So I'll start by saying that the city's Department of Planning and Development manages the overall brownfields program for the city. So all of the projects associated with any assessment and cleanup work are managed through our office. We do hire licensed site professionals or environmental professionals, as they're known in some other states, to help us with the assessment work, and then we bid contracts for abatement, cleanup, or demolition activities. So we're generally managing a contractor for those types of projects. And then the second part of the question again, Sean, sorry.
Sure. It's how many individuals are involved with the abatement and demolition, and what is the budget for the Uniroyal demo?
So the Brownfields program is managed by my entire staff, which is 6 full-time individuals and 2 interns. And we work on all components of grant administration, cooperative agreement oversight, and management of the various contracts for assessment and cleanup. So it's really the 8 of us that do everything together. And then the budget for Uniroyal to date, between Uniroyal and FaceMate, I can't break out because we've had some projects that have happened at the same time. The city, through various funding sources, so this includes cleanup grants through the EPA, state funding through Mass DEP and Mass Development, which is our development agency. We've invested over $30 million in assessment and cleanup work, and are looking at probably another $5 to $10 million to finish the work that we have at Uniroyal to make it developable.
Okay, great. Next question. I'm not sure exactly who they're directing it to, so feel free to jump in and answer it, whoever would like. Your slides indicate a state-of-the-art climate connection. Does this encompass preparing for increased flood levels? So I'm not sure if that's for Lee or...
I'll jump in and do a brief answer.
Sure.
So for the Uniroyal and FaceMate properties, for us, we're protected by an Army Corps levee system in that particular neighborhood. And so the city's efforts have been to make sure that that infrastructure is maintained in accordance with the Army Corps of Engineers requirements to keep it certified. We have, particularly with the senior center and the private developer on the assisted living facility, we've looked at managing stormwater through green infrastructure technology instead of gray infrastructure. And the building itself, the senior center, was designed with LEED silver in mind. We never pursued actual LEED certification for the building, but that was the standard that was set by the city when the building was designed.
Okay. The question, they actually clarified they'd also like to hear from Ben. Ben, if you could respond.
Yeah, I think I'd mentioned that not so much in the context of flooding, which is important to be aware of. That's on your site. It was more in terms of new construction and what you can do in new buildings. In Biddeford, the old mill buildings are wonderful. They're really loved, but they're a little colder in the winter and hotter in the summer. So developer sees opportunity to create buildings that are better insulated and less carbon impact. So that's there. And then certainly there are many opportunities to retrofit an old mill with insulation, with insulated modern heating and cooling systems as well. In case they were seeing that as a differentiator for the new development to complement the mills.
Okay. Next question. Have any of your projects maintained the buildings into clean manufacturing facilities? So, and the follow-up there is sad to lose former manufacturing job creators into residential office predominantly. So who would want to jump in and respond to that?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. Our project, much smaller on scale than some of these others, doesn't have any residential as part of it, and we are trying to create jobs, trying to attract tenants that would create jobs that are accessible to the neighborhood, manufacturing jobs are definitely an industry that we're hoping to attract. We focused at the minute on food businesses, but have talked to a number of others around a kind of light manufacturing that could be a fit for our factory. Obviously, typical manufacturing jobs, facilities, prefer everything on one floor with large loading docks and highway access, and many are put off by city streets and a space is split over multiple floors, and so that can be challenging for kind of larger scale manufacturing. But yes, for smaller scale kind of craftsman manufacturing, there is an opportunity there. And another focus that we've tried to look into is kind of job training. So maybe not the actual manufacturing itself, but training for those skills, particularly in kind of advanced manufacturing. Where there is a great need for people, and where there are kind of workforces retiring, and in communities particularly like North Hartford, there's a need for jobs. Unfortunately, the people are living in the city, and the manufacturing jobs are often in the suburbs, and there's one, a lack of training, but two, a lack of transport to get out there, which kind of speaks to the need for good public transit to get people to the manufacturing jobs out in the city.
You're right. Anybody else want to add to that?
Light manufacturing, the pepper mill in Biddeford, for instance, they have a patent in a manufacturing facility as one of the many tenants that's there. There has a lot of research going on. One of their outfits is DECA, the inventors of the Segway. They're also involved in like regenerative tissue research. So they have like prototyping facilities, makerspace, and sort of not large scale manufacturing, but workshops where they are testing out their research to make sure that it's working right. So they definitely do need sort of industrial the office and residential uses.
Thank you, Ben. Another question for Patrick. You mentioned the extensive public engagement with the neighborhood. What were some of the most effective tools that you used or developed through the process to get folks involved?
So I think there's a few things. Obviously, I'm not from the neighborhood, and they don't look or sound like people in the neighborhood, and so kind of having people on staff who are from the neighborhood or have a strong board who kind of represent the neighborhood is critical. And the community engagement and kind of developing trust takes time, and it's taken us kind of 8 years to get to construction, and it takes time for people to trust you and what you're doing, and that requires being open to attending kind of lots and lots of community meetings and presentations, and attending kind of partner events as well, to be engaged with other organizations, and kind of listening. doing a lot of listening, and then kind of the events that we try to host. There's trying to target those for kind of high impact and low cost, and if you want to get people out, the best way to do it is to have good weather and have music and food, and the word gets out and people show up. We also tried, not just to create our own events, but to, if there was something that we needed to, go to an event or a meeting that was already taking place in the city. Our local community organization has a monthly kind of community meeting, and we make sure to attend that every month to report out on what we're doing. And then the other thing I would say is that, no matter what your efforts are, win over 100% of the community. There's always going to be, people who are skeptical and cautious and don't, aren't really on board with what you're doing for whatever reason, and that's just sometimes that happens. But with a lot of work and effort, you can get the majority of people to kind of buy into your vision if you're kind of sensitive and work with them.
Okay, thank you. Last question, and this will go out to whoever wants to respond. When developing former factories or mills, are there additional advantages to including plans for affordable housing in federal applications for these kinds of funds? Does anybody want to jump on that one?
This is Lee from Chicopee. I'll give it a start. The city has never predominantly said affordable housing would be part of any specific redevelopment, although housing is identified in our redevelopment plan for River Mills as a priority of the community. I will also say that I think it's economically specific to the area and the community that you're working in. For Chicopee out in Western Mass, the difference between market rate and affordable levels is almost non-existent. So almost by default, any housing that gets constructed in our region ends up being affordable. So it hasn't been a priority issue for us in that respect.
Okay, thank you, Lee. So that's the last question, but I do have one for all three panelists. Over the course of this four-part webinar series, we've heard a lot about, and in your presentations today, we heard a lot about partnerships, developers, identifying funding, community engagement. So for a community, a town, a city that doesn't have a lot of experience in pursuing this kind of redevelopment, what would you say in your experience is that one first critical step that anyone that decides to pursue this should take? And there's an eerie silence. Does anyone in the panelists want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a stab at from our point of view. I think you've got three different kind of viewpoints here on the call. You have a city who's thinking about kind of the city as a whole, trying to get developers in. You have a design professional, and then kind of a developer. Us as a kind of a non-profit developer coming at things from a different take than a private developer might have. But any of these projects kind of do take they take time. So kind of making sure that the expression I like to say is if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go together, so you need time to build those relationships, time to community buy-in. These sites are in disadvantaged, and particularly in kind of recent highlighting on justice. It's important that our point of view is it's really important that these sites are rehabilitated and that the community is involved in the process and they have a outcome of that. Large contingencies for the unknowns that come up the underground disappear, and they, you know, happens through permitting, and then the tenants that walk away, you know, during bidding or whatever, you know, being flexible and being able to adapt and change as things develop.
Great advice. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to share in response to that?
Ben,
Sure.
go ahead, Lee.
Oh, thank you, Ben. So I would say, and for Chicopee, we decided from a very early point in the planning process that it was critical to take as much time as necessary to really build a community vision for these properties. I think in our case, it was unique that the city owned all of the property, so we could really take as long as we wanted in determining where we wanted to go. But without doing that, it would be very difficult for us to communicate to our residents why this project has taken 10 years to get to where it is, particularly with Uniroyal, where so much of the work is happening beyond where people can see from a roadway. We still today deal with people who think we're not getting any work done there when actually there's a massive construction project happening to demolish buildings. And so we really allowed ourselves to take the 2 years to put together a plan for what we wanted to do, which also allowed us to be really honest with the community about what buildings we could potentially save and how those might be redeveloped within the framework of our economy out here in Western Mass.
Excellent. Thank you, Lee. Ben, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, and ownership, certainly in Biddeford, Maine, that because the city doesn't own much of infrastructure, how can you turn a street to trade network? It's really many. Size, about all the projects we've done, state money and particularly transportation funding has been really important for planning and some of the implementation. So in Biddeford, there's regional metropolitan planning organization money that's helping fund the bridge study, bridge planning that would connect downtown Biddeford and its mill to the Amtrak station. In Manchester, transportation dollars that are paying for the study, you know, with a initial focus on but that really translates land use and all the questions of urban design that then would sort of justify and leverage that commuter rail service. So you know, definitely look to your state partners, not just for the remediation, but also for the infrastructure side for both planning and implementation.
Excellent. Great. Thank you, Ben. And thank you to all the panelists for your responses. We have no more questions. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Colette.
Okay, thanks, Sean. So this brings this webinar and the webinar series to an end. I want to thank our wonderful presenters, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. The NJIT TAB program also thanks EPA Region 1 Administrator Dennis Diesel and all of the great staff at Region 1's Brownfields office for their continued support in the NJIT TAB program and in the planning of this webinar series. Thanks so much. Take care.